over there is if somebody comes on in a kind of militaristic way, in a macho way, we demand that a person walk their talk. And our speaker tonight is certainly a man who has walked his talk. He spent 19 years in the United States Marine Corps, 13 of those years with the Central Intelligence Agency as a paramilitary case officer. During his time with the CIA, he held managerial positions in 3 secret wars in the Congo, Vietnam, and Angola. In 1977, he resigned from the CIA, and since that time, he has been a staunch critic of the agency and their use of covert operations in the Third World. When this man talks, there are a lot of critics around criticizing just about anything you can think of, and some of them deserve to be listened to, and some of them perhaps don't. Our speaker tonight is someone who definitely deserves to be listened to because, as I said, he has walked his talk. Please, let's give a warm welcome to John Stockwell.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I love Denver. I lived here for a while. I was living here, as a matter of fact, in 1964 when the CIA recruited me to go to work for them. I had gotten out of the Marine Corps and come here and gotten a job with Gates Rubber Company. I also appreciate the snow today. You may not, but I'll be down in Texas scorching tomorrow, and it's nice. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight on a very important and complex and dense subject. I'm going to be obliged to insult your intelligence by racing through some issues that are very profound and very important, like the Vietnam War, and deal with it in one sentence, so to speak, and the covert action in Angola. The answer is that I will take questions afterwards, and you can direct, into an area, or if you want to see more about this one, or the CIA and drug, sex, disease experimentation on people, or the CIA on campus, or the CIA and U.S. society. We can get into more specifics during the question and answer. And then, of course, hopefully, I'll give you some guidelines from which to read and inform yourselves and proceed to analyze the world as we go on working separately, addressing the grievous problems that are facing our planet today. I have had this talk called on other occasions, Escape from Armageddon, the Hope and the Dangers. And if that's pretentious or sounds pretentious, I don't believe it is, because we are in fact talking about a planet that Helen Caldicott says is terminally ill. We're talking about tonight about the secret wars of the CIA and the nuclear arms race in the age of Gorbachev, Glasnost, and an ex-CIA director president. We've got 1989. I've called it, others have called it, a year of change, hope, and healing. We've got the greatest opportunity in the last 40 years to actually bring an end to the Cold War, turn back the arms race, reach out for true world peace. We're witnessing major perceptual breakthroughs, broad international awareness of the hazards of the arms race, of the CIA's depredations on the world. We're crossing at thresholds of concern about world health problems and these environmental problems that are no longer something projected vaguely into the future. Moreover, there's a growing sense of the world's interdependentness, its interconnectedness. We've got Gorbachev on one side in the Soviet Union with his policies of Glasnost, opening up the Soviet Union to the great relief of the whole world, making possible the INF Treaty, which permits for intrusive inspections by the superpowers of each other's facilities so that you can have a degree of practical trust while we work, hopefully, to roll back nuclear weapons. He has proposed that we should begin rolling back all strategic nuclear weapons by the end of this century. He has begun, in fact, pulling his troops unilaterally back from Middle Europe. The Soviet troops have left Afghanistan. There are now trainloads of Jews being permitted to leave the Soviet Union. He's promised to examine the Berlin Wall, and given his track record, you can expect for something to happen eventually on the Berlin Wall. And he's calling for international organizations to join together in examining world environmental problems. Meanwhile, on our side in Washington, President Reagan just left office claiming peace victories. He said because of his policies in Angola, the Cubans have promised to withdraw their troops, and the South Africans are giving Namibia its independence. He's noted that the Soviets have pulled their troops out of Afghanistan because, again, of his pressures and policies. And because of his policies, the Vietnamese have pulled their troops out of Kampuchea. He said the world is a safer place than when he came into office in 1981 because of his policies, because of the INF Treaty. Meanwhile, we have President George Bush telling us that we're a kinder and gentler and more humane nation. He talks about goodness and greatness. He talks about 1,000 points of light in his administration. He has spoken about a 50% reduction of strategic nuclear weapons. The objective tonight of this talk, of our being together, is to examine the reality of this hope. The questions that we're asking is this all true? Are these people sincere? Is the Cold War over? Is the arms race beginning to wind down? And what can we do about it? We do live in a planet that is faced with truly grievous problems that threaten its viability today. Carl Sagan and his wife Andrea Yan, in an open letter to President Bush in Parade magazine in November 27 of last year, he noted that the United States has spent $10 trillion on the Cold War. He notes that's enough money to buy everything in the United States except the land itself. He also notes that we've booby-trapped the world with 60,000 thermonuclear weapons. The United States has just finished spending $2.2 trillion on the largest military buildup in the history of the world. Simultaneously, and not coincidentally, we acquired the largest international debt in the history of the world. The Center for Defense Information counts 40 wars that are being fought across the globe, in which they estimate 4 or 5 million people are going to die. And there's deep concern that the United States is still on the brink of its next war, the Central American War. If this seems remote to you, it was only a month ago that there was open discussion in the media about whether or not the United States, George Bush, would put U.S. troops, U.S. Marines, into El Salvador if the FMLN pressed for a military victory. And we have troops in camps in Honduras poised to go. And within the last 18 months, the top 3 leaders of our country have said that if they couldn't, meaning the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, have said that if we couldn't do the job in Nicaragua with the Contras, we would have to go in and do it with the U.S. Marines. The United States for the past 8 years has been maintaining an open policy of supporting what they call low-intensity conflicts in every corner of the globe. Oversight Committee members of the Congress tell us that our CIA, our national security establishment, has been running 50 major covert operations. And of course, there are hundreds of minor covert operations. This would have us destabilizing about a third of the countries in a world that's already about as unstable as it can get. Integral to all of this is the rape of the environment. In 1987, human beings dumped 5.5 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere and deforested an area of the trees that purify the air, an area about the size of one of our smaller states. Meanwhile, the United States is drowning in a sea of drugs. Not counting heroin, just cocaine. The published figures by the DEA, published in the New York Times, is that the importation of cocaine from Central America went from 1,000 kilograms a year in 1981 to 35,000 a year in 1987. And these subjects all interrelate. Drug trafficking, the arms race, conventional wars, the rape of the environment, and the CIA's secret wars. For one thing, they're all said to be part of our national security. Because of this national security, they justify, or our policies responding to these problems, are justified in terms of security, of secrecy, of their not telling us what they're doing about these things as they proceed to address these problems. However, we now have massive documentation about what our national security establishment is all about. I always urge people to read books. If you rely on newspapers or the TV as your source of information about what's happening in the world, you're getting information that's being given to you, being selected for you by the editors. The tickers run around the clock. The editors go in and strip off stories and read them to you in the 6 o'clock news, which means they're deciding what you should know about the world on a given day. And by their choice of words, they're biasing that information for you. For example, if they tell you that the Sandinista regime has done something repressive and the Reagan or the Bush administration has done something noble, then unless you're very perceptive, you suck up on it and have a bias against the Sandinistas and kind of feel good about what's happening in Washington. The French have a saying that I mangle in translation that goes generally, them that don't do politics will be done. If you don't get your heads involved, if you don't fill your minds up with facts and knowledge and understanding by reading books and by traveling and by discussions, then it's an unfortunate fact that we are programmable. Other people will program you with impulses and reactions and false information so that they can eventually come along and punch buttons, and you'll give them money that they don't need to profit from an arms race that no one needs. Or if you're a young man, you'll go joining, the army and marching off to war to get yourself killed, or to kill people unnecessarily, perhaps. I publish a bibliography, by the way, to document my lectures. I read a lot, and I selected out of the hundreds of books that have been published just in the last 10 years. And this great eruption of information that we now have about what's really happening in the world, I've selected out the best 120 books that I've found on the subject and put them together in a little booklet with an introduction and a conclusion and a thumbnail sketch of each one, organized according to subjects to make it easy for readers to browse which one they want to read first and in what sequence. You can get a copy of this bibliography by writing to my home. My wife runs a small nonprofit office, and I mean nonprofit in the sense that she doesn't draw a salary, photocopying these bibliographies and binding them and mailing them out to people. The address, I'll leave a stack of my cards at the back after the end of the lecture, before the question and answer, so that as you leave you can get a card with the address on it. If you want to jot it down, it's Post Office Box 1030, like 10:30 in the morning, in Elgin, Texas, like Elgin watches. And the zip is 78621. We need to ask you for $7 to pay for this thing. We don't have institutional support, and that's what it costs us to mail these things out. Getting back to these CI secret wars and the state of the world we live in, we know that the policies of covert control of the world began in 1933. Before that, we controlled other countries in this hemisphere through the direct use of the Marines, and follow up to the Monroe Doctrine, where we staked out our right simply because we were more powerful to manipulate directly the affairs of other countries. There was a great protest, a peace movement in this country and abroad that forced us to withdraw the Marines, and we created a National Guard in Managua, in Nicaragua, and put the Somoza family in charge and supported them and armed them and controlled Nicaragua by proxy and avoided the criticism of having our Marines occupying the country. This became a policy. It was interrupted in World War II, and then it became a systematic policy after the war. The U.S. set about to create oligarchies in every country of the world that it could, Latin America particularly, but also Asia and Africa, training military and police officers in our academies, paying their salaries, arming them, creating a fraternity in which they would be bonded to our military and feel more loyalty to us than they would to the peasants in their own country. Meanwhile, through the manipulation of money, creating a financial oligarchy tied into the military and police that would once again be bonded financially through millions and billions of dollars into our banking establishment and therefore be threatened and have contempt for the people of their own country who would be wanting to take some of this money for their own selves and their own uses. Meanwhile, to reinforce these oligarchies, the CIA was quietly running thousands of covert operations, which we have a great deal of information about them now, even though they were originally supposed to be covert. There were essentially 4 levels of CIA operations through this period of the Cold War, the 4 decades that this war has been fought. One was to establish the oligarchies. Destabilization of countries, breaking them apart, attacking the economy, stressing them out. And of course, those are just words. For the people, that have meant, as you'll see in a minute, a lot of suffering. Eventually, coup d'etats to install military governors in countries where we could pull it off, and economic and election manipulations, creating a facade over a country of a democracy, of an election, for example, in El Salvador, where they simply slaughter people who are in the opposition and slaughter journalists who are writing the truth about the country, while we created the military, we created the death squads, and we spent $3.3 billion in supporting this military oligarchy just in the last 10 years alone. Once we get a government in power that we like, then the policy is to maintain what we call then the status quo, or we call it stability in El Salvador, or for example, in South Africa. We're supporting stability there and saying, yes, it may not be perfect, but the chaos that would result and the damage to our national security interests, therefore, we must. When a country succeeds in breaking free, the people somehow rising up and busting loose from the oligarchical repression, then we go after them violently. Countries like Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Nicaragua, breaking free from our hegemony of us fighting them in Vietnam with a war, a full-fledged war, in Cuba, Angola, Nicaragua with an open destabilization, military attack, a low-intensity conflict, trying to go in there and overthrow the government or break the government with military pressure. And if that fails, then our fallback plan is to stress the country out economically so it remains a negative example so that other countries won't dare or will see it in their interest not to follow suit. For example, right now in El Salvador, the FMLN could achieve a military victory, but they're holding off and pressuring for a negotiated solution because they know that if they did succeed in a Sandinista-type revolution, that we would target them viciously for decades to come. And so they're so far now, I don't know how long they will hold back, but so far they're holding back on the final insurrection, hoping to pressure the country into a viable negotiated solution. The Church Committee report in the middle of the 70s was the first big breakthrough that we had of knowledge and understanding of what the CIA's covert operations, the secret wars as they call them, were all about. Senator Church, of course, it was very dramatic, published daily his new findings. He reported that he found that in the 14 years alone before he ran his study, the CIA had run 900 major covert operations and several thousand minor covert operations. Extrapolating those figures over the full 40-year period of time, you come up with something around 3,000 major covert operations the CIA has run and over 10,000 minor covert operations. Now, this is a lot of mischief. Every one of these operations is illegal in the countries, the targeted countries, breaking U.S. law and international law. They also destabilize other societies. And when you're getting into 13,000 of them, and some of them quite big and quite bloody, you're talking about contributing enormously by a factor of 13,000 operations to world instability, to making the world an unstable place. Some of these things are bloody beyond belief. Indonesia, 1965, the CIA set out to discredit the Communist Party with a plot to make it look like the party was going to rise up and kill everyone, catching arms with documents that could be found by the police and shown to the press and run in the newspapers that would show the communist plan to take over, until eventually, with all the other tension we helped to create, the situation flashed and the army went after the communists And the New York Times reported that between 500,000 and 1.5 million people were killed. The Australian Security Service said the figure was closer to 2 million people that were killed in the bloodbath there. And the CIA's own internal reports were told by officers who had custody of it as they left the agency that it concluded this was a model operation to be copied elsewhere in the world, because we had not only broken an effective national communist party, we had eliminated the entire segment of the population, the Indonesian ethnic Chinese, that tended to support the communists, and thereby the CI was advocating, if you will, it estimated that 800,000 people had been killed, and this is an advocacy directly of genocide. Now, each of these covert operations is carefully rationalized. Even if it's not public, like the Contra program, it's rationalized within the State Department, within the Congress, within the CI, within the national security complex. It's rationalized as being necessary to our national security interests. It's rationalized in terms of it being in our backyard and the Soviets coming, for example, as they said in Nicaragua. It's rationalized in terms of anti-communism. These rationales don't hold up, however, or they become highly suspect when you start multiplying them times 13,000. And then you start examining and seeing President Reagan going to become friends with Gorbachev, communist Russia, and Nixon and Reagan going to communist China to make friends with them, and then saying, as Reagan did when he went to China in 1984 to bolster his chances for re-election, when people said, "What are you doing over there in that communist country?" he said, "We want to win them over, befriending them, to draw them closer to us. Well, obviously, if we could do this in China, and it worked to a degree, surely this policy could work in a country like Nicaragua or Angola, instead of going in and spending $1 billion to brutalize the country. The propaganda, understanding the propaganda. The presidential spokespeople, read the full edition of the 1988 of the Foreign Policy Quarterly, the article by Bob Perry and Peter Karnbluth about the Office for Public Diplomacy that was created under the Reagan administration in 1982, eventually cracked open by the Congress and investigated. The Congress found that they were spending our tax dollars to pump propaganda out to us, i.e., a formal propaganda ministry. The director of this program, under oath before the Congress, admitted that his charter, his commission, his purpose was to, as he put it, to paint white hats on the Contras and black hats on the Sandinistas, to make the Sandinistas look evil to the public, to the media, to the establishment, to justify the Reagan administration's attack on these people. Read, if you want to get the best summary, the quickest summary and overview of the CIA's secret wars. There are a number of excellent books out. I recommend that you read The CIA, A Forgotten History by Bill Blum, or The President's Secret Wars by John Prados. Both of these books broken down by a different approach, giving you a good overview of the entirety of these activities that we know about in the public record. Another excellent book is The Secret Government by Bill Moyers, which has the beauty of conveying the full impact of these secret activities, these secret wars, in a beautifully readable style. You can read this book in 45 minutes and get a good sense of exactly what the CI has been doing. Classic CI covert operations or secret wars that you can read about in more or less whatever detail you like include the overthrow of functioning constitutional democracies in over 24 countries, how they did it, where they did it, and what the results were. One of these, of course, is Chile. 1973, organizing the overthrow and killing of the democratically elected President Salvador Allende and installing the dictator Pinochet into power, creating standing armies and arming them and encouraging them to fight. Going to the ethnic minorities in countries and arming and encouraging them to rise up and fight. The first thing we did in Nicaragua was to go to the Mosquito Indians, to people with whom the CI had contact before, to give them more money than they had seen in the entirety of history, and arms and training and rationale, and a safe haven in Honduras, and send them back into Nicaragua to kill, to burn crops, to kidnap, to rape, to pillage, to destabilize, to break the society apart. We systematically created, trained, and funded the death squads. like the Treasury Police in El Salvador that was created by the CIA under the Alliance for Progress in the early 60s. If you remember the Henry Kissinger quote when he was grilled by the Congress about the Chilean operation, and he gave us the famous rationale, he said, "The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." Now, these activities get us into wars. There was a long CIA destabilization and propaganda campaign against China. We were parachuting and boating teams in, Contra-type teams, just as we've done against Nicaragua and other countries, into mainland China from the islands of Quemoy Matsu, from Burma, Thailand, Tibet, with the propaganda campaign here in the United States until we eventually worked ourselves up until we fought China in the Korean War, and 1 million people were killed. There was another long CIA destabilization and propaganda campaign that led us into the Vietnam War, in which 2 million people were killed. And once again, if you would like to get a sense of this, we can take a couple of minutes in the question and answer and review the techniques that they used, the CIA, to get us in, to drag us into the Vietnam War. Or if you want to go and read afterwards for yourself how we were orchestrated into that war, I would recommend the book, The Portrait of a Cold Warrior, by Joseph Burkholder Smith, who was a case officer who served in Vietnam, or Fire in the Lake by Frances Fitzgerald, who was the daughter of Desmond Fitzgerald, the CIA's famous chief of operations in Southeast Asia, or Deadly Deceits by Ralph McGehee, who was another case officer who served in Southeast Asia, or Decent Interval, the book by Frank Snepp of the period of 1973 to 75 and the evacuation of April 75. I was there. I was a colleague of Snepp. I came out in April with him. I'm mentioned in his book. Or if you wait a bit, you can get the book that I'm co-authoring, just finished. We just shipped it off to New York with my wife, called Over the Tunnels, which is my account of the rationales of what kind of people we were and why it was so hard for me to break away from what we were doing, the shackles they put on your mind as they condition you, and we'll talk about that a little more in just a minute. And my wife, who is Vietnamese, writing about her anger about this war, the woman's anger at men's wars, the frustration of having to try to make her life and raise her children in the shadow of this war. This is something I don't believe our society has in fact ever addressed, the woman's view, the Vietnamese woman's view of the Vietnam War. Then there's a program that we have to take 1 minute on, 1 minute longer on, because it gives you a sense of the power of rationales and the danger of rationales. This is the Office for Public Safety, the Public Safety Program. For 26 years, CIA trainers were running torture training programs throughout Latin America and Asia and places in Africa. Now this one, you can read about it in the United Nations reports. Amnesty International published thousands of pages of testimony about it. The world pressure, world outcry eventually forced the United States Congress to investigate. You can read our own congressional record if you like. If you want to get a condensed form of all of this, I recommend the book Hidden Terrors by A.J. Langeth, who was a journalist with the New York Times, now a professor with the journalism department of USC. If you like to get your information from video, from film, I suggest the film on company business, or the film State of Siege, or the excellent film The Houses Are Full of Smoke that's winning awards today by Alan Frankovich, where he went into Central America and interviewed the leaders of the death squads themselves. Now, what is this thing all about? To give you an example or a sense or a feeling of it, the most famous exponent of this thing, this torture training, was a man named Dan Mitrione. He did 7 years in Brazil, 3 years in Uruguay. The reason we know about his life is he was eventually kidnapped by the people he was persecuting, and when they drew world attention to him, then they killed him to draw more attention to him. So his life and activities were investigated, and we got a sense of what this thing was all about. Mind you, I was in the CIA, I was in Africa. None of this was going on in the post I was in. I was as shocked as anyone else to get out and read and understand what kind of activity could be hidden in a United States embassy. Dan Mitrione teaching the techniques of torture. How do you teach torture? I'm Dan Mitrione. your class of Brazilian police officers, he would have beggars picked up off the streets. I mean, you give a lecture, you show a film, you do some homework, but you got to get your hands wet. He would have beggars brought in off the street to be used as guinea pigs in his torture training classes. And when they would collapse from the pain, he would have doctors brought in to shoot them up with vitamins to rest them up for the next class. There was a woman named Angela who was tortured for 2 years in Brazil and eventually released from the pressure of the international outcry and testified herself to tribunals and helped bring this thing to a close. You can see her in this film on company business, I believe, and also she's mentioned in the book Hidden Terrors. She said that the horror of this thing went beyond the pain itself. She said if the people doing the torture had been raving psychopaths, she might have been able to escape by going insane. But she said the people doing the torture were very sane, normal people, keeping her mind present in the room while they worked on her body to get access to her mind. She told about an incident or an episode in which she was being tortured in a room, naked on a table with a half a dozen men doing these incredibly painful and degrading things to her body, and there's an interruption. The Americans call to the telephone in the next room, the others take a smoke break, and she listens while he's saying, "Oh, hi, honey. Yeah, I can wrap it up here in another hour or so and pick up the kids on my way home." Now, we're taught carefully in our lore, in our schools, in our churches, in the television, that we're the good guys of the world, that it's Aryan Gestapo maniacs that do evil things to other people, that it's Slavic KGB monsters. The vogue now in the missing in action films is that it's sadistic Vietnamese colonels that torture the helpless MIAs. The truth is, people do hideous things to other people if their society rationalizes that it's okay. It's been done since the beginning of history. Dan Mitrione was not a raving psychopath. This man was a devout Catholic. He was a devoted family man, father of 4, highly respected in the embassy community in which he lived. And yet he had devoted his life to torture and gotten so deep into it that after his death, police chiefs testified that they would be invited to dinner in his home, and after dinner, when it came cigar and cognac time, he would take them down in the basement where he had people chained up in padded rooms and demonstrate over cognac some of his latest thoughts and techniques. Now, he did this believing he was right because our society had rationalized that there was something so sacred about national security that this was necessary, even torturing people that he knew were not guilty of anything in the whole world. To make sure, when he was killed and exposed, that his colleagues were not demoralized, the United States Congress, he got a medal, and the vice president went to his funeral. Trying to come to grips with the entity of this thing, this 40-year war that has been fought, adding it up, the scholars, myself, Noam Chomsky, Dan Ellsberg, Peter Dale Scott, the others studying, reading, Bill Bloom on this thing, we come up with a minimum figure of people killed in these things of at least 6 million people killed. It has to be that. It has to be much greater than that, in fact, an absolute minimum figure. 1 million in the Korean War, more or less. How can you count exactly how many people die in Cambodia in the bombing, for example? 800,000? How can you count? 2 million in the Vietnam War, 2 to 3 million altogether in Cambodia, 800,000 according to the CIA's internal report in Indonesia, 20,000 perhaps in the Angolan operation that I ran for a subcommittee of the National Security Council in 1975 and 76. 22,000 is the figure the New York Times gives, and the Sandinistas sometimes use, for the number of people killed in our contra-destabilization of Nicaragua as we attacked the Nicaraguan economy in order to put pressure on the government, in Managua. You're familiar with all those rationales. Now, you try to study these things, reading through all of them and taking notes and thinking, we've killed 6 million of our enemies out there so we can be safe and secure here in the United States, right? But you see, that doesn't add up. You begin to find some common denominators. One, you find that since 1954, we do not do these gruesome things in the Soviet Union. 1954 being, coincidentally, the first year in which the Soviets developed their first capability of actually dropping an atomic weapon on the United States. You find that we don't do these bloody, gory things in England, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, etc. You find these things are all done in countries of the third world, where the governments simply aren't strong enough to force the United States to stop brutalizing their people. That's why I call this thing the Third World War, a war by the United States against countries, the people of countries of the Third World. These 6 million people dead are people of the Mitumba Mountains of the Congo and the jungles of Southeast Asia and the hills of northern Nicaragua. Conspicuously, they don't have ICBMs or armies or navies. They don't have any capability of doing physical hurt to the United States. Take the 22,000 that have been killed in Nicaragua as we've destabilized that country for the last 7 years. Most noticeably, they're not Russian soldiers or advisors. They're not Cuban soldiers or advisors. They're not even percentage-wise mostly Sandinistas. What they are is almost altogether rag-poor peasants, including a high percentage of women and children living out in the villages scattered throughout the country. Communists? I'm sorry, this thing is rationalized to stop communism, but these 22,000 people we've killed, they're not communists. They're almost 100% Roman Catholic peasants. Enemies of the United States, 22,000 enemies we had to kill to protect our interests in Nicaragua. I'm sorry, but there have been dozens of thousands of witnesses who've gone from the United States and Canada and Europe to Nicaragua during these 7 years to see for themselves. And they go into the villages and live with these people, and they invariably come back and report that the Nicaraguans are the friendliest people on the face of the earth, that they love people from the United States, and they can't understand why we would want to hire people to send them into their villages to kill their children while they're forced to watch, or to kill the parents while the children are forced to watch. Now, reading and studying on these things, you find that covert operations do not work in the United States national security interests. I make a flat, blank statement. I have issued challenges to CI directors and published CI officers for public debate to show us any of these thousands of operations. I'm not saying show us that half of them worked or a third of them worked to justify the rest, but to show us any of them that clearly worked in the long-term U.S. interest to make our country a stronger and safer country. And you can see one after the other that has greatly damaged U.S. national security interest. We encouraged the Hungarians to rise up in 1955 and 56. They rose up. We were parachuting leaflets, sending in agents. They rose up. The Soviet army was provoked to come in and did, and repressed them. And there wasn't any chance on the face of the earth that we would go in with our army and fight Russia in Hungary. And the result was that the 20,000 Hungarians died, and the Soviet Union was left with iron-fisted control of Hungary. Another example, the O.P. Mongoose destabilization of Cuba. Fidel Castro came down out of the mountains and swept across Cuba and took power in Havana in early 1959. But there were lots of competing factions. There were lots of people that didn't like him. It was by no means clear that he would consolidate power and actually control the entirety of the country, and the process would have taken a long time if he had been left alone, or the Cubans had been left alone, in fact. What did we do? We created a CIA station on the University of Miami campus called the JM Wave Station. And we created a secret army. This thing's been covered in documentaries by Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Bill Moyers. The Senate Church Committee exposed it. It's thoroughly documented in the public record. Hundreds of teams boated and parachuted into Cuba to burn sugarcane crops, to burn houses, to mine roads, to blow up department stores, to blow up clinics, to blow up schools, to kill people. And the result of all of this, all of these teams coming down from the United States to brutalize the people, was that the people loved the United States, right? And this is a natural reaction that they said, wow, wonderful United States, thank you, see. Now, obviously, what was the reaction? The reaction was that they were horrified. Fidel was able to open his armories and give every Cuban a rifle, and then organize them down to the blocks in the villages and towns and cities, with people patrolling all day long and all night long, unified to fight off the attack from the United States. We gave him iron-fisted control of Cuba on a silver platter through that covert operation. If you want to read that thesis, read the book The Perfect Failure by Trumbull Higgins. Now we have a change coming on. We have Gorbachev talking about an end to the Cold War. We have Andrei Kozyrov, a Soviet Foreign Ministry official, writing an article in the Soviet Foreign Ministry Bulletin, republished in the New York Times on the 7th of January, 1989. You can go back and read it for yourself in your library, in which Kozyrov is saying that the Cold War was a mistake for the Soviet Union, that it discredited the Soviet Union, that supporting people's movements around the world wound up costing the Soviet Union, getting us into the arms race, making the Soviet Union pay a dear price. He said that the Third World has opted for the capitalist solution and that it's now in the Soviet Union's interest to join with the United States in supporting stability in the Third World and the status quo so that the Soviet Union can join, have greater credibility, and join in more effective trade in its own interest. So, calling for an end of the Cold War, and George Bush calling the United States a kinder and more humane country. This is very exciting. But first you've got to look at a few other odds and ends that are involved in the history of this Third World War. One is drugs. In every area in which the CIA has operated a major operation, we've left behind a major functioning drug cartel. Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, these planes that we were flying in to destabilize China, the Kuomintang, the Chinats were flying back out with heroin. When we took over from the French after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, we took over Southeast Asia. They had been flying the heroin. The CIA's Air Forces, air transport, civil air transport, and Air America began to fly the heroin, delivering it to the drug smugglers in Saigon, Bangkok, Taiwan, Hong Kong, eventually again creating the Golden Triangle. Similarly, the largest covert operation in the CIA's history is said to be the operation in Afghanistan, which continues today, and sure enough, the world's largest source of heroin today is in the Golden Crescent, in Iran, Pakistan, and India, from whence we're running this major operation. And then, of course, you're familiar with the revelations of the Kerry Committee, and then the prosecutors down in Florida prosecuting 24 people that they caught with cocaine who were involved in the Contra program. The Medellin Colombian cocaine cartel saw these planes flying, the CIA operatives being amoral by definition. It's a dirty world, the CIA says. It's the dirty wars in the alleys and gutters of the world. The people you have to work with are not nice people. They will do, unfortunate things like smuggling drugs. The White House knew these planes were flying back into this country with cocaine and marijuana. We have the evidence, for example, that Robert Owens reported this in writing to Oliver North, and it was not shut down. We have the evidence that when the prosecutor in Florida went to try to investigate, to prosecute some cases, Ed Meese, the Attorney General, intervened and said, stay out of it, it involves national security interests. We have Senator Kerry saying that national security can never be used to cover for drug smuggling into this country, which in fact it was and is being done from Central America. If you want to get a review of this from video, I recommend you dig up a copy of the show Guns, Drugs, and the CIA, edited by Leslie Coburn on the Frontline PBS show, or read the book The Iran-Contra Connection by Peter Dale Scott, or The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Al McCoy, or The Cocaine Wars by Paul Eddy. You read that one and you suddenly realize that Miami Vice is not fiction. And then you read Out of Control, the book, again by Leslie Coburn, summarizing this importation of cocaine by the U.S. government or people working for us from Central America in the Contra program. Now we're faced with the breathtaking scandal of having this man Noriega, a former CIA paid agent, according to George Bush. In the public debate with Michael Dukakis, he admitted that Noriega had worked for the CIA under 7 presidents. Now military dictator and indicted drug mogul of Panama, boasting that he has blackmail control over George Bush, who is now President of the United States. See for yourself, dig up the Newsweek issue of May 23 of 1988 of last year about Noriega, which closes with the quote from Noriega, quotation marks, "I have George Bush by the balls." Now, putting a CIA director into the presidency, of course, he's bringing a lot of baggage, like Noriega, contacts and illegal activity with the drug smugglers and the criminals from every corner of the world with him into the White House. I worked for George Bush in 1976 at the end of the Angolan operation. We had broken many of the same laws that the Iran-Contra cabal broke. We had lied to cover up what we were doing. We had conspired to keep our lies coherent, to cover up what we were doing. The Congress was investigating. Bill Colby, the CIA director, was fired. Bush was brought in to help deflect the Congress. Bush did not come in as CIA director to clean house. He did not come in to investigate and find out who had broken the law and punish them. He came in instead with the purpose of fending off the investigations. He would have us brief him, then he would go to the committees, and he would say, "Senator, I'm not calling you a liar. I just have difficulty believing that these wonderful people in the CIA that I'm meeting would ever do anything like you're alleging." And then he would say, "But I'll check for you and report back to you." And then he would go back a week later and say, "I've investigated. I find no evidence whatsoever to confirm what you're alleging." Meanwhile, during that week, and I swore under oath to the FBI and to the congressional committees, he had sent, or his office, the general counsel had sent a young attorney down to my office to go through those files, my files, and purge them of any documents that would be incriminating if the files were subpoenaed in a full investigation, i.e. that could convict him of perjury for telling the Congress that their charges were not true. I watched him do essentially the same thing in the investigation of the killing of Patrice Lumumba and the investigation of the killing and coup d'etat in Chile, the killing of Salvador Allende. In the killing of Orlando Letelier, a bombing in Washington, D.C., and Ronnie Moffett killed with him, George Bush, the CIA director, again, did not immediately investigate, who had done the killing. He immediately went to the Justice Department and said, "We need to soft pedal this thing because it involves national security, because it involves our relationship with the Chilean Secret Service." And it turned out, in fact, that DINA of officers were involved, had engineered this thing, along with people who had been on the CIA's payroll. Now, there was a wave of criminal activity in Florida, all the way up into New York, of bombings and murder and drug smuggling by people who were veterans of the OP Mongoose destabilization of Cuba, who had been cut loose and turned to massive criminal activity. George Bush, as CIA director, went to them, worked with them, met with them, and said, "You've got to take your act out of the country. It's getting too hot." They moved down to the Bahamas in September of 1976 and had a conference and formed this CORU, this counter-revolutionary unit. And 1 month later, on the 26th of October, 1976, they bombed a passenger plane that was taking off from Barbados, killing 73 passengers in a pure act of terrorism. Then you see George Bush resurfacing as vice president. In 1982, he agreed to use his offices as vice president to front for the Black Eagle operation that was put together to resupply the Contra program that was just developing. This thing immediately was co-opted by Noriega, who was bought into the thing by the Medellin, and he provided the airstrips, and the planes were loaded with drugs. When it became too heavy in the drug smuggling, they closed it down and switched to the Enterprise. And we have, since 82, this man Don Gregg, a former CIA officer who had been in Vietnam with Felix Rodriguez, a veteran of the Bay of Pigs, longtime CIA operative. Rodriguez put in Ilopango, running the Contra Air Wing, wearing the uniform of El Salvadorian Air Force, Don Gregg working as George Bush's national security advisor. The telephone records showing that Rodriguez was reporting regularly, daily, to Don Gregg and flying up to see him and going in to see George Bush. Meanwhile, we have the testimony, for example, of Milian Rodriguez, who was laundering the money for the Contras, saying that he passed $10 million to Felix Rodriguez as the Medellin bought into these planes to have access to these planes, to use them to fly the drugs directly into our bases up here in the States. George Bush denied having any knowledge of these activities. This is an implausible deniability. It is not very possible they could be run from his office and he could be meeting with Don Gregg daily and Felix Rodriguez regularly and not know what they were doing. But beyond that, even if he didn't know, when these people's activities were exposed, he did not expunge them or see that they were punished. In fact, he retained his association with them and they continued to work for him. One of the people that Felix Rodriguez, that they hired into this program, was a man named Luis Posada Carillas, who had been in jail in Venezuela for having blown up that airliner that was taking off from Barbados. And Rodriguez's explanation was, well, we needed him. This is a clear terrorist working for Rodriguez, for Don Gregg's office right in the Vice President's office itself. Now we have a couple of other things to touch on, and then move on to the broader, more important subjects in a sense. The MK-Ultra program, CIA secret activities dribbling back into this country. They have a license to do these things overseas. Are they going to behave inside the United States? Not likely. The MK-Ultra program, systematic experimentation on American citizens with disease and drugs over a 20-year period of time, 175 projects involving swine fever, dengue fever, experimentation with bacteria, with viruses. In 1981, 70 pounds of this deadly virus, chikungunya, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, disappeared from Fort Detrick, Maryland, where they were conducting these experiments. You have the experiments that we know about. We don't know about all of their activities, but the ones that we found out about, like about 4 of the 175, include leaking viruses through a barge being dragged in the bay in San Francisco to measure that technique for poisoning a city, having canisters leaking viruses in New York subways to measure that technique for, again, crippling a city, provoking whooping cough epidemics in Florida communities to see what it would do to the communities if all of the kids got sick of the whooping cough. The LSD thing in this society literally was a CIA experiment conducted through Harvard Medical School, in which the pseudoscientists involved eventually got involved in using the drugs and became Johnny Appleseeds and were actually pumping them out into the society. If you were reading the newspapers last October, you noticed that there was a settlement announced between the CIA and the victims of an experiment at McGill University, where the CIA had been funding a mad psychiatrist to experiment on his own patients and without their permission induce neuroses by giving them different kinds of drugs and then measure their reactions to these drugs and whatnot. If you want to read about this one, there's some new material in The Agency by John Rainley. There are a number of other books, including In Search of a Manchurian Candidate by John Marks. There's a new book out, Clouds of Secrecy by Leonard Cole, published in 1988, in which he notes that the Army, speaking for the CIA, claims it still has the legal right to conduct experiments on American citizens with disease and drug without their permission or knowledge. Colonel White, who ran this program, created this program, wrote from retirement in a letter to a friend, and then agreed to let it be published. He wrote, quote, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the blessings of the All-Highest?" Then you had the MH Chaos program, a billion-dollar program to manipulate activities on campuses and in labor organizations, recruiting and corrupting professors, paying people to write CI propaganda books in their own names. Those books are still in your libraries until today. The titles have never been revealed. Recruiting journalists to work for the CIA, to put their stories into the major media. Again, the propaganda ministry. To give you a sense of the amount of effort that goes into that, in the Angolan operation, 1/3 of my task force was professional propagandists whose sole job was to put the stories into the media that would convince the American people and hopefully some people of the world, but the American people was the target, that our cause was just and that the communists were the cause of the problems in Angola. And then if you want to read the book Blowback by Christopher Simpson, you can get a detailed exposition of how the CIA recruited Nazi intelligence and secret police officers at the end of World War II and used them to create a network of agents that they ran into Middle Europe. These agents were reporting, because the Nazis hated the Russians, were reporting that the Russians were about to attack in what would have been World War III. In fact, the Russian economy was shattered. Their army divisions were exhausted, but nevertheless, this pounding away of intelligence provided an infusion of energy into our leaders' feelings about the Cold War, into launching the Cold War itself. And then they were given, these are people like Reinhard Gehlen and Klaus Barbie, and then they were given documentation and papers and brought into this country to help create our intelligence network, and brought into Latin America, where they ran operations for the CIA and participated in this Office of Public Safety torture training program. It should be no surprise when you find in the Iran-Contra cabal that these people involved in these activities, William Casey from the CIA, Oliver North and all the others involved with them, would be of a mentality to blow off the Constitution, to blow off democracy. When the Congress passed a bill saying the nation doesn't want more aid to the Contras, they would form a private outfit with private secret security officers. And Oliver North would call in the FBI to target and harass people who were simply opposed to the Contra program. Fascist Nazi techniques, punishing politically, using the secret police to punish people who disagreed with you publicly. Or to find that they had created FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was systematically planning for the military takeover, for martial law, to suspend the Constitution. They were planning to do this at the time of the invasion of Nicaragua, which they never succeeded in doing, and the Iran-Contra scandal broke up their plans, but the FEMA plans are still on the books. Formal plans for declaring the Constitution invalid, suspended, and declaring martial law and putting the military out in the streets of the cities across this country. Meanwhile, with all of these activities going on, the effect is to distract the people of this country and the world that are affected from the real problems that really do affect the security of our nation and our world. But first, you've got to be screaming, why? Why would a nation of good people, of people in Washington who sincerely believe they're good people, many of them in fact Christians, whatever that means, believing in certain human standards, or saying they do, of human rights and civil rights, why would they want to organize 10,000 covert operations to kill and slaughter 6 million people in countries of the third world that couldn't hurt us if they wanted to? Some of the answers you get into, it's a complex subject in a complex world, but some of the answers that you obviously get into is simply economics. But not economics at the simple level of us fighting in Nicaragua to preserve our access to their markets or to their resources. Nicaragua produces coffee and cotton, and the world overproduces coffee and cotton. Nicaragua could stop producing anything, and it wouldn't affect the world economy. What it is economic at a different level. These activities, as I'll show you, relate to the arms race, to the nuclear arms race, the most profitable industry in the world. The production of arms is up to about $3 billion a day. The defense corporations make about 35% profit on the production of arms. We just got through spending $2 trillion, again, the largest arms buildup in the history of the world, and we're at peace. So the purpose was not to protect ourselves or to fight a war, it was so these people could make their profits. The result of this gigantic arms buildup and these expenditures is that we've created a society dominated by the interests of what President Eisenhower, a very conservative president, called the military-industrial complex. The U.S. taxpayer is now carrying a gigantic burden. 1/3 of our budget goes to the military. The Washington Post has published a study in which it estimates that 53 cents of every tax dollar you pay goes to the military. Meanwhile, to pay for this, every social service in this country is being slashed. We cannot afford to care for the old people, the poor people, the handicapped, the farmers, the students. 25% of the people in this country are functionally illiterate. We're sixth in the world in terms of the percentage of our students, our children that are kept in school. We're 10th in the world in quality of education. We're 7th in the world in terms of life expectancy. And we're 20th in the world in terms of infant mortality. But we can't afford to rebuild the infrastructure of our society and our own health and educational facilities because we have to have this gigantic defense. To sell this to the American people, obviously you have to have an unstable world. If the world were at peace, we wouldn't buy it. We would insist that our funds be spent on schools, on building the infrastructure of our society, and quite possibly schools and hospitals in other countries of the world. This is where you get into the CI's destabilizations, brutalizing the world to make it unstable, to provide rationales. But meanwhile, you also have to condition and program the people of this country so they'll be receptive. I call this the politics of paranoia. The easiest way to motivate people is the football pep rally. Rah, 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 let's go kick ass. Get them fired up, punching the buttons of macho, of fear, of paranoia, of aggression, getting people fired up so they're ready to go and fight for you. Follow me and I'll make you strong. Follow me and I'll protect you in an evil and dangerous world. The conditioning to war begins at the age of 2 in this society. When we put our kids in front of the one-eyed babysitter and we turn it on and they watch 10 to 15 to 20 shows a day, all of them with the same plot. Nice little people who are put upon by evil forces. They're always handsome, attractive people, usually light-skinned, by the way. Dark, evil forces. They always say, please be nice, we don't want trouble. And Skeletor, the evil forces always insist on rising up. And at the last minute, the good guys, He-Man, Sheena, the Thundercats, they leap up and smash the evil forces, cut, commercial, and you go right to the next show. Until it's estimated that we've watched more hours of violence on television by the time we graduate from high school than we spent in the classroom itself. And then you look at the stuff that we feed ourselves at a slightly older age in this particular cycle to war, and it's been done at other times in the past. But just in the last 8 years, this period since 1981 that President Reagan said he has made the world a safer place. Look at the movies. Rambo, Commando, Red Dawn, the Rocky series, Under Siege, Delta Force, America, Missing in Action, Top Gun, Heartbreak Ridge, Death Before Dishonor, Platoon, Hamburger Hill, Tour of Duty, China Beach, and they go on, coming on one after the other, each more violent and bloody and gory than the other one. How many people, this is kind of fun and very enlightening, how many people saw the film Red Dawn? Don't be bashful, it was a great film. Now, this is the wrinkle. Now, how many people, when you saw it, were aware that this was a film was intended to propagandize you? Because the producer of this film went around going on talk shows saying, yes, I wanted to make a film that would get people fired up, to make them understand, to feel war, and erase the Vietnam syndrome and everything. Now, let's just for fun take 1 minute and look at how do you propagandize people through a film? To review this film for you, it's science fiction. It has a force of Russians, Cubans, and Nicaraguans have invaded the United States, and they've gotten all the way to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and that's where the movie starts. They're there, Science fiction, blow off our military, blow off our rockets. It's just, you accept the fact that they're there, and that's where the movie starts. And so you ask yourself, if they wanted to do a better film, why did they pick Nicaragua? Why didn't they pick Canada? Because you see, Canada is an industrial country, and up there close to Russia, and if they came across and made a pact with Canada and joined Canada, you could almost get into that, coming across the border at 20 different places and pinning us against Cuba, and you could almost feel, that one. So why did they pick Nicaragua? And the answer, of course, was they don't plan to fight a war against Canada, but they were trying to orchestrate public opinion to prepare people to fight a war against Nicaragua. Now, this force gets all the way to the Rocky Mountains, where it's eventually stopped by the high school football team. Now, you ask yourself there, why the high school football team? The 80s, after all, this was the decade of the middle-aged women. Dallas Dynasty, Murder, She Wrote, The Golden Girls, middle-aged women, Nautilus, Working Out, Linda Evans, Joan Collins is older than I am, and she's a sex symbol. I mean, an 80s movie would be to have this force get to the Rocky Mountains where they'd be stopped by middle-aged school teachers. So why did they use the high school football team, drinking deer's blood and all of this stuff? And the answer was obvious. They're not going to fight the next war, which they planned against Nicaragua, with middle-aged school teachers. We're too smart. The 50-year-olds are too smart. We know about war. We're skeptical. They're going to fight it with the next generation of people coming out of high school, whose minds are blank, and the young males, with what Carl Sagan calls testosterone poisoning, the male hormone of violence pumping in their bodies, the exploitation of males. Now, this is not to say, that males are greatly exploited in our society, but nevertheless, since the beginning of time, societies have exploited the testosterone factor in young males to get them to use this aggression hormone to get them fired up, to march them off, to fight the wars for the country. And you have the pounding away of TV commercials. Join the Army, be all that you can be, with these fabulous tanks jumping ditches and laser-guided cannons and computer-operated equipment. And this fabulous, fascinating commercial about the lad coming home on leave from the Army in uniform, and he's met by his brother at the train, and he's saying, Dad never did understand why I had to join the Army. How many people have seen this one? And then they're driving in the car, and he says, do you think Dad will ever forgive me? And the younger brother says, well, Dad. And then they get into the house, and the father melts and hugs him, and it's okay. What's the point of this commercial? It cost many millions of dollars. What's the point of this commercial? The point is, there's lots of middle-aged dads who saw the cynicism of the Vietnam War, who are telling their sons, do not join the Army. And this commercial is a social statement that in this society, it's okay to blow off your dad's advice and join the Army. And then there's the one that I really hate. It goes, we are the armed forces, we are your country. Well, they're not my country. At least they're not the entity of it. Our country is schools and mountain and people and songs and study and business and commerce. And the armed forces is somewhere way down the list of what I consider to be my country. So we have the CIA destabilizing every corner of the world for 40 years straight to provide the justifications for the arms race. However, at the end of 40 years, we come to find that the arms race is breaking the economies of the superpowers. The defense corporations, what we call defense corporations, are in fact multinational corporations. They are selling the U.S. economy down the drain. They make an MX missile and put it in the ground and take their 35% profit from our tax dollars, and they invest the money internationally in businesses where they're trade goods, where other countries profit and benefit. And these countries could care less because their allegiance, again, is to the corporation and to the multinational. While the U.S. is producing MX missiles, our allies are producing Sonys and Toyotas and Hyundais, and they're passing us by with the trade deficits. One of the great ironies of this, the middle part of this century, is the fact that the Vietnam War was fought under the threat of the domino theory. If we did not draw the line in Vietnam and stop communism there, the states of the Pacific Rim would go communist until eventually it would roll up to Mexico, and then Colorado would go communist. So we had to draw the line in Vietnam. So we went in and fought a war there, and 2 million people were died, and we were whipped, and we left. And the Pacific Basin did not go communist, it went capitalist. Capitalist industrialist. And in fact, right now, the giant trade deficits are going in favor of the countries Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, and Japan at the expense of the United States. We are becoming a debtor nation with our national security at stake because these countries did not go communist. Had they gone communist and had screwed up economies, we wouldn't be in the economic trouble perhaps that we're in today. Or to put it another way, if you will, President Reagan directed literally more presidential energy into his Contra program in Nicaragua. Nicaragua, a country with 2 elevators, while Japan proceeded to capture 30% of the overseas international exchange, and the United States became the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. In 1981, we had the capability of destroying 85 Soviet Unions and rendering 20 planets uninhabitable. Now, despite the INF Treaty, the world is 4 times as dangerous as it was in 1981. The U.S. and the USSR have effected since then a 40% increase in their strategic nuclear weapons. Since the INF Treaty was implemented last summer, the United States is currently racing to deploy the B-1B bombers, the B-2 bombers, the MX missile, the Trident II, the Star Wars experimentation, developing the Midget Man, and other systems that they're deploying as fast as they can. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union has deployed 3,300 more sophisticated thermonuclear weapons. In 1981, their primary beast was the SS-18, a liquid fuel rocket that they could aim at Colorado. And now these new ones they've built, they can aim at this building at a 150-yard radius circle. And the Soviet Union, despite all the wonderful things they seem to be saying and challenging, they're proceeding with all their development and production, in addition to which, if you notice the newspapers a couple of months ago, they were offering to sell to any countries that were interested nuclear reactors for use in space. And we come to find out something that our intelligence knew that they didn't tell us because they didn't want to scare us about the arms race. The Soviet Union has had nuclear reactors up in space for 20 years. They've got a new version. They're the people who built Chernobyl. And they now have developed a new version that they're willing, to market internationally in order to gain some hard currency. And you read and you learn that there are now 9 countries producing and deploying thermonuclear weapons with delivery systems. They tell us not to worry about these things because they say they're fail-safe. But truly, we can read headlines even if you don't have time to read the books themselves. Take a couple of years ago, in one winter's time, the Challenger 2 blew up, a Delta rocket blew up, 2 Titan missiles blew up, the French Ariane blew up, the Chernobyl plant blew up, and a Soviet SS-18 blew up, and it was not a particular bad year. If you'll take more recently, they just grounded the B-1B bombers because they're all found to be defective, and a week and a half ago a Trident II blew up. We've dropped 7 bombs accidentally out of airplanes. The one we dropped over South Carolina, they never found it. The pilots didn't fix the coordinates in time, and they went back and looked, so they bought a huge tract of this swampland on the coast of South Carolina and declared it a nuclear restricted zone, and that bomb's still there in the water rusting today, unless, of course, someone else has found it in between. 3 days ago, in my talks, I was saying 5 submarines have sunk to the bottom of the ocean with nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons on board. But you caught the news day before yesterday, another Soviet submarine went down. 4 of theirs, 2 of ours, 6 submarines have sunk in the bottom of the ocean. We recovered 1 of ours and 1 of theirs. That leaves 4 submarines with nuclear weapons on board in the bottom of the ocean today, with the weapons and the reactors rusting away, of course. And then there's the hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive waste that will still be toxic 1 million years from now. We currently have a program costing us $2 billion trying to figure out how to store that stuff safely for just 10,000 years, because we can't even estimate geologically what's going to happen to the world beyond a 10,000-year period of time. And allocating billions of dollars to clean up the toxic waste that we've dumped around the plants around the United States. In Pentex, near Amarillo, Texas, they had this liquid waste, this hot water, radioactive water, and it was too much trouble to haul it away, and they didn't know where to put it, so they got bulldozers and they scraped what we call tanks in the ground and dumped the water in there. They didn't even bother to seal the tanks, not with rubber, not with chemicals. They just dumped the water in there so it could percolate down into the Oglala aquifer, and it could evaporate, and it could blow into the surrounding fields. And then there's the huge stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons that have the same capability of destroying all warm-blooded life on the face of this planet time and time again. And then there's what they call the poor man's atomic bomb. You have countries that don't have nuclear weapons yet, but they have delivery systems, countries like Syria, and it costs, all you need is a room this size. Very inexpensive to build the chemical and biological weapons that will wipe out a whole city. What would happen, for example, if Syria goes to war with Israel, and Israel with its nuclear weapons, and Syria with its planes delivering the chemical and biological weapons which it has, to the same effect that both societies are completely obliterated. And then you get back, of course, to the rape of the environment that continues apace today. You can get lecturers, of course, who can come in and talk to you just about the state of the environment, but simply put, to simplify the thing, the rate we're chopping down the trees, the rate we're poisoning the environment, and when we cut the trees in the rainforests in the Amazon, we burn them, putting the carbons up into the atmosphere. So it isn't just a question of cutting the trees that clean the air out. We have about 5 years until the damage will be irreparable. The environment has already started to heat up, and the heating will continue, and we haven't begun to stop it. So you're getting into the greenhouse effect, which is going to have major climatic changes around the globe, not in the year 2025, but within the next 5 years. We have to get on this, or it's all over, or it's downhill after that. The problem is that the world is ready for a change on all these fronts. But at the same time, the world is geared into the economics of the arms race. The military-industrial complex has 40 years of momentum of doing these things, and they don't know how to stop. The Soviet Union is now getting smart in its own economic interests. It's calling for a rollback of the Cold War and of the arms race. But the downside of Glasnost is that they're not looking after the interests of other people. They're not looking after the interests of the third world. This Kozyrov article, they're proposing to collude with the United States to support the status quo around the third world so that they can join in the trade. Trade equals exploitation of the third world. Status quo, you recall, is what we call the oligarchies, reinforced by the military, reinforced by the death squads. This will be, if it evolves, a major step towards a world security state. If the United States and the USSR in fact join forces to support stability through military police around the world. Meanwhile, that great Democrat Henry Kissinger, being an utter fascist and Nazi in every instinct he's had, who engineered the bombing of all these people in Cambodia, the secret bombing of Cambodia, for example, he's writing articles saying the U.S. and the USSR have much more in common than the United States does with countries of the third world, and that we should retool and retrain our military to be prepared to fight wars against the third world instead of against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, we have the personality of the Bush administration becoming clear. Look at the senior appointments that he's put out. John Tower, that he tried to appoint, a man bought and paid for by the military-industrial complex. 4 CIA operatives being assigned to high diplomatic posts. Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor supervising my war in Angola back in 75 and 76, is put back in the same position to run the same activities for the White House today. John Negroponte, former CIA officer, switched over, became an ambassador. The engine, the mastermind of the destabilization of Central America during the 80s, has been assigned as ambassador to Mexico in a situation that is erupting there, in which the United States is setting out for a counter-destabilization program to control the status quo in Mexico, to prevent democracy from taking its course there. Vernon Walters, former deputy director of the CIA, going out as ambassador to West Germany. Richard Armitage, involved in CIA operations in Southeast Asia, involved in covert activities in the Middle East, is assigned as Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. Don Gregg, remember him, from Bush's office with Felix Rodriguez, with Luis Posada Carillas. He's been nominated as ambassador to Korea. And then you have William Webster, the CI director under George Bush, saying publicly that we're going to have to educate the people and educate the Congress to understand that the CI will have to continue running covert operations throughout Latin America and the rest of the world. And William Bennett, the drug czar, as they call him. This makes me nervous after the FEMA planning to have anyone in our government called a czar, planning a war against drugs in which they're proposing to use the National Guard. Remember FEMA and its martial law plans. George Bush, within the last month, has proposed to use the National Guard in our nation's capital, to put the soldiers on the streets in a martial law declaring curfew and all of that. Meanwhile, the National Guard is now being used down on the border in Texas to police the border. This is the first time substantially that this nation has gone into using our military to police. We have never had to fear our military arresting us and harassing us and busting us, and this is what they're moving directly towards right now under George Bush's new policies. Meanwhile, you look at his international policies, this kinder and gentler nation of ours. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union said, we have pulled out our troops, now let's both superpowers cease giving arms to the factions in Afghanistan to force them to negotiate a peaceful solution. And George Bush refused. In Angola, he has promised to continue aiding Savimbi in the destabilization of Angola. Savimbi's given credit for creating a situation in which 55,000 people are walking or crawling around Angola maimed from his destabilization, his landmines, his attacks. In Kampuchea, we support the faction that includes $12 million we spent last year, $7 million has already been allocated this year to support the faction that includes the Khmer Rouge. In Nicaragua, George Bush pressed for military aid after Honduras had agreed to force the Contras out of its country. He failed, but he got humanitarian aid for these people, and he coerced Honduras to withdraw its agreement in the peace process, and somehow he's bought off Arias, so that Arias is now agreeing with this plan of their continuing to keep the Contras alive as they continue to put pressure on Nicaragua, as they continue to kill villagers inside Nicaragua. And then in El Salvador, we're committed to supporting this military kakistocracy to the end, having spent $3.3 billion on them in the last 8 years alone. While George Bush is talking about a kinder and gentler country, thousands of people continue to die in covert operations and low-intensity conflicts with our tax dollars, because of our tax dollars, all across the globe. What he is doing is putting the sea back in covert action while he continues the same policies. If Ronald Reagan was called a Teflon president, then George Bush has to be called the Vaseline president. Meanwhile, you have his nuclear policies. He's proposed to withdraw 50% of the strategic nuclear weapons, but I went to the Center for Defense Information in Washington and asked them about this plan, and they said, well, they're already... Eisenhower said, the people of the world genuinely want peace. Someday, he said, the leaders of the world are going to have to give in and give it to them. Now, I say, is the time for us to rise up with the people across the world and demand that the leaders proceed to shut down the Cold War and the arms race and devote the world's resources towards peaceful processes. If you've heard Helen Caldecott lecture, at the end of her lecture she says, get out and get involved on this project of saving our world. It's your world too and mine. It's not just Ronald Reagan's and Nancy's and Georgie's and Maggie's and Gorby's. It's our world too. And they're not going to save it for us unless we force them to, unless we create a situation where they have no option but to stop this playing games with the destiny of the earth. And Helen Caldecott notes that if you will get involved in this stuff, you'll feel a lot better for taking charge of your own destiny and participating in the process. And she notes that if the bombs start going off someday, if they're a few minutes before the one goes off in your town, at least you'll have the right to turn to your loved one and hug them and say, honey, at least we tried. You look about for hope to bring this to an end. things people can do. Is there any hope? We're up against the military-industrial complexes of the world. How are we going to crack that one? And it's a tough one. But you do see examples, and I want to cite two so that we can end this on a sense of empowerment, if you will. Two beautiful examples. We could spend the evening talking about other examples, but I like these two particularly. They're very special to me. One is the women's movement. 80 years ago only, a man could put his wife and sisters and daughters to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in factories, and then pocket their salaries, and there was nothing they could do about it if he went out and got drunk and blew the money. And that's been changed not by accident, but by the determined struggles of feminist activists. And the beauty of it, the reason I like the example so much, to the evolving situation of women in our society today, is that they did it without cracking skulls. They did it without killing people. There's some fabulous books that have just come on the market that you must read. One of them is Robin Morgan's book, The Demon Lover, The Sexuality of Terrorism, a feminist view of war. Another one is just hitting the market by Giuseppe called Women on War, a collection of essays and poems by women across the world on the subject of war. Another one is written by Marilyn Waring, the Member of Parliament of New Zealand, whose resignation over the issue of a nuclear-free New Zealand actually led to the constitutional crisis that made New Zealand a nuclear-restricted zone. Her book is called If Women Counted, summarizing women's contribution to the world and noting that if women were given credit or power according to their contribution to the world, the difference that it would make. And the difference, of course, is that resources would be allocated towards family and people problems instead of towards killing and violence. The second example I want to cite is the professor who stopped the war. My war in Angola. Then young Professor Jerry Bender at UC San Diego had done his studies in Angola. He saw what we were doing. He was frustrated. He finally had a bright idea. He picked up the phone. He called his senator, Senator Tunney. He said, Senator Tunney, I have an expertise in Angola. I see what the CI is doing. I think they're lying to you. I think it's dangerous. I would like the opportunity to brief you. And he briefed the senator, and the senator went back to Washington and investigated and found that it was true and introduced the Tunney Amendment to the FY 76 Defense Appropriation Act that stopped my war in Angola. Admiral LaRocque, I went to see him to ask his advice. What can people do? We feel disempowered, and people ask me. I said, I don't know what to tell them. And this beautiful old man who served, with the military for years and then figured it out and started the Center for Defense Information, we were having breakfast. He stood up. He said, I love that question. I tell people to do what you feel capable of doing, what you're comfortable with. He said, I don't know these people, but you know yourselves. You know what you can do. If you can write articles, write letters, write telegrams, write books. If you can organize, or join an organization and work to the best of your abilities. He said, I tell people if you can travel, go down to Nicaragua and see for yourself a destabilization in process. He said, I tell people if you feel comfortable lying down in front of trucks with bombs on them, to lie down in front of trucks with bombs on them. But he said, I tell people you have to do what you can do every day of your life, beginning today. You can't wait until you graduate this summer or get married or get divorced or retire or whatever, for the simple reason that these missiles could start malfunctioning any time. There may not be a world here by the time you graduate this coming summer or next winter, for example. Thank you very much for hearing me out. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I just returned from Angola and a short visit in Zaire, and saw with my own eyes the amputees and the suffering that we're causing in that country. And while we were in Angola, we heard rumors of United States government operatives working to build bases along inside Zaire to move UNITA away from Jamba and through Zaire into northern Angola. Can you say anything about that?
Well, a little bit. I'm familiar with that. I have not been back to Angola in a long time. You've been there recently. And before you step down, I want you to comment under what auspices you were going back to Angola, or to Angola. But basically, this Kamina base in southern Zaire, this is my second home. I lived there for 10 years. I went to a boarding school just north of Kamina. This base was built by the Belgians with U.S. aid as a strategic military base with heavy-duty runways back in the 50s, and then maintained off and on and used during the 60s. During the 60s, we used it, the U.S. used it to train and resupply the South African mercenary force, Mike Hoare's army, to beat down the Mulele rebellion and beat down the secession of the Katanga state, or attempt to secede from the Congo. This base, according to all reports that we're getting, has been refurbished to be used again as a U.S. strategic base, especially to support the destabilization of Angola, although it is, for the same purpose throughout Central Africa. What's happened is, as South Africa has agreed in this negotiated settlement to withdraw, to give Namibia its independence, and the Cubans agreeing to withdraw, this has created a situation where Savimbi's position, which was possible only because of the South African support, is now tenuous. Even with the South Africans, he suffered major military defeats and major battles. And so they have to create a place where he can have a safe haven from which to run his raids and destabilization into Angola. The complexities of the Angolan situation, now that's the subject. When I ran this program for them, keeping meticulous notes, and then I testified to the Congress for days about the laws we had broken, then I wrote my book, In Search of Enemies, which is the only insider account of a major covert operation. The ironies and complexities of the Angolan operation illustrate, as well as anything in the world, the inanity of the national security rationales of the covert operations. Just to cite two, Zaire is our big client state in the central part of Black Africa. Its primary resource is copper. The copper is mostly located in the Katanga. The only economically viable way to get this copper out to the world is through the Benguela Railroad, which goes through Angola. Savimbi, with his destabilization and his raids, has kept that railroad closed for about 15 years, more than that now. And we continue to fund him, to give him Stinger ground-to-air missiles to shoot planes down, and to keep the railroad closed, costing our client state enormous revenues. Another example of the irony and folly of these things is this thing we fought in Angola in '75, and we lost, and we lied to the public and to the world, and we were discredited. I can talk about this, obviously, in great length, since it was my war. At the end of this thing, see, Gulf pumps the Angolan oil from the fields in Cabinda. Now, we forced Gulf to stop pumping the oil because they were about to make a $115 million payment to the Bank of Angola, whereas our entire budget to destabilize the country was $31 million. So we threatened blackmail investigations we blackmailed Gulf, threatening investigations of their bribery in international affairs to force them to put that money in escrow instead of delivering it to the Bank of Angola. When we were stopped by the Congress, we had to release Gulf. They're pretty powerful, and they were lobbying. We had to let them, give the money and resume operations, put their technicians back in to pump the oil. Those technicians were protected by Cuban soldiers to protect them from CIA mercenaries who were destabilizing that part of the country. And they have continued to be protected by Cuban soldiers for many of the years, the 14 years since. Yes, how did you get to Angola? Under what auspices?
I'm chair of the Africa Committee of the United Church of Christ, and we were there visiting the Evangelical Congregational Church of Angola. Our church has taken an anti-UNITA stance and pro-recognition of the government of Angola. and we were there as guests of the church, and we did have tours guided by the government.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Hi, we recently observed the 25th anniversary of a very shattering event, the assassination of President Kennedy. And I don't expect that you have any direct knowledge about this event, but I want to share with you some excerpts from an article in The Nation magazine that came out July 16th of 1988, and I'd like your reaction on this. It's titled "George Bush CIA Operative." It's written by Joseph McBride, and it says here that the FBI memorandum dated November 29, 1963, is from Director J. Edgar Hoover to the State Department, and is subject headed, quote, "Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, November 22, 1963, unquote." In it, Hoover reports that the Bureau had briefed, quote, "Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency," unquote, shortly after the assassination on the reaction of Cuban exiles in Miami. A source with close connections to the intelligence community confirms that Bush started working for the agency in 1960 or 1961, using his oil business as a cover for clandestine activities. And there's a couple of more excerpts I want to read. However, the intelligence source who worked with the agency in the late 50s and through the 1960s said of the vice president, quote, "I know he was involved in the Caribbean. I know he was involved in the suppression of things after the Kennedy assassination." And then Ralph Yarborough, I think was once a senator from Texas, was quoted, "I never heard anything about it. It doesn't surprise me. What surprised me was they picked him for Director of Central Intelligence. How in hell was he appointed head of the CIA without any experience or knowledge? Hoover's memo explains something to me that I've always wondered about. It does make sense to have a trained CIA man with experience appointed to the job." Now, the CIA, after this article came out and it was excerpted by the wire services, denied that it was, George Bush, who's now our president. They said it was another George Bush, a George William Bush. Well, this author, a few months later, tracked down the George William Bush, who claimed to be a lowly clerk in the CIA for a very brief period of time, and now works for Social Security as a claims person. What's your opinion on this? I have some, it seems to me that it has a certain amount of credibility, but there's no way of proving it, and I'm disappointed that the article just names an intelligence source. You think it's a red herring, or is there something, real about it?
I have a great deal of respect for the nation. I am familiar with that research, of course, with those articles. We do not know for sure. It's very plausible. I.e., I believe it is very plausible that George Bush had a relationship with the CIA dating back many, many years. This does not necessarily track, however, Ralph Yarborough's conclusion that, well, that explains that he's a CIA man as a qualification to become director, because the only way you would gain a real qualification would be if you worked your way up in the ranks, learning about the infrastructure and the bureaucracy inside the CIA. Having been an outside CIA contact, working with the CIA in different capacities, wouldn't give him any particular expertise to become a director. I think he was picked for CIA director for political reasons, making a deal with Jimmy Carter, and he definitely was using the position to build his run for the presidency in 1980. He brought in with him the Track B team, as they call it, the B team economists, right-wing economists, who would take the CIA's figures of the Soviet military production and cook them and double them so that it would appear that the Soviets were launched in a gigantic military buildup, which he could use as a justification for his run for the presidency. Vote for me, they're in a big military buildup, I'll protect you. The trouble is that Ronald Reagan aced him out of the Republican nomination in 80 and used his homework for his own run at the presidency, and Bush had to wait 8 years to get there. Yes?
I've heard several references to what would be FEMA Rex 84 as the plan, I believe. And I was wondering if you could shed any insights on its tactics, execution, and targets, because I think that's a very close thing to us as citizens of the United States.
Sure. We have a good profile of FEMA, the Rex 84. We were onto this. I was describing its activities and structure in my lectures 5 years ago. Spotlight first brought the thing out, and then others of us got into it. And what it is basically, it dates back to Ronald Reagan's days in California when he was setting up his view of the world, what would eventually become the Reagan Revolution. He helped create the California Special Training Institute, which was a seminar in San Luis Obispo that would teach the techniques of population control and repression to generals, National Guard generals, law enforcement officers, municipal officials from all over the country. In the opening address of that seminar, which was headed by Luis Giuffrida, he made a statement to the effect of, you know, there are some people in this state who, if they could see us assembled here today, would say that their worst fears of being recognized, that I'm planning a military takeover. And then they proceeded to run this seminar regularly until, by 1979, AP reported that 14,000 people had graduated from it. People, again, from the National Guard, the Defense Department, Bell Telephone Company, corporate defense executives, that sort. The techniques of repression. Luis Giuffrida, in his confirmation hearings by the Congress, promised to use the syllabus from that school in the establishment of FEMA. Now, we have that syllabus. It's been in our possession, and an article was published about 3 years ago. You could easily dig it up, by Ken Lawrence in Covert Action Information Bulletin, in which they summarized what the training was all about. Basically, it was how to torture, terror tactics against the people, how to divide a city, how to declare martial law, how to deploy the troops, how to infiltrate groups and disrupt them, how to create bogus groups that would compete with them and discredit them, and also the planning for detention. Part of this program, the FEMA program, the Rex 84, was the creation of another 10 detention centers in Army camps around the nation in which they could incarcerate. They had a capability developed, because none of this has been changed, a capability of incarcerating 400,000 people. Their own memos say that this would be aliens who might be restless in our next war, such as Nicaraguans, when we invade Nicaragua, if we invade Nicaragua, and dissidents in this country. This mentality dates back to Governor Reagan's view in California when people were protesting on campuses, and he was saying, if there has to be a bloodbath, let's get it over with. And he called out the National Guard, and he gave them orders to shoot to kill. Now, you recall, getting into the mentality of this thing, it's all still on the books today. It was published, now we all had it in the progressive community. Again, I'd been using the material in my lectures for years, but the Miami Herald ran an article during the Iran-Contra hearings 2 years ago in the summer, noting that Oliver North had coordinated closely with Luis Giuffrida, the head of this program, and James Brooke, the congressman from Texas, raised this Miami Herald article in those hearings, noting that the article claimed that FEMA proposed to suspend the Constitution. And Dan Inouye told him that they couldn't talk about that it was classified. And Brooks asked the question again, and Inouye again admonished him that we can't talk about it, it's classified. Now, I submit to you that when people begin plotting to suspend our Constitution and declare martial law without giving us a chance to vote on it, and then tell us we can't know about their plans because they're secret, we're literally on the verge of a coup d'etat. They called it the Reagan Revolution. What they were planning to do, meaning Mr. Reagan and William Casey and Oliver North and that cabal, they were planning in the fall of '86 to invade Nicaragua in February of '87. All the major journalists that I knew in Washington, Seymour Hersh, David Martin, the analysts that were there in the IPS, the CDI, were saying that the date had been fixed for February of '87. And at that point, they were going to slap this thing on us and permanently change the nature of U.S. society, get the pendulum over to the ultimate right, use the justification of war. By that time, they'd appointed enough judges that would, conservative judges, that would support Reagan's policies and the war, and weld the pendulum shut far over to the right, permanently changing the nature of U.S. society. Is the threat over? In no way. The law is still on the books, the judges are still in office, and once again, George Bush, within the last month, has proposed more than once, as a matter of fact, to use the National Guard in the war on drugs and to deploy the National Guard in Washington, D.C. itself. These people are slathering on their chops to use the military to police our society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, John. My name is Henry Varnum, and I've followed you for a few years in the 80s, beginning on talk radio with the Ken Hamlin Show, and ever since then you've piqued my interest, and I want to personally thank you for the work you've done and being here tonight. This is the first time I've heard you in person, and I much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Recently on KGNU, I had a chance to hear Gore Vidal on the subject of the national security state, in which he seemed to articulate a number of the transgressions in the name of, quote, national security. And it seems to me that what you said tonight is that we've come so far within the context of the national security state that there exists an ever-widening gap between the people of the United States, the citizenry, and the secret operations of the U.S. government. My question concerning this is, what exactly do you think a person could do in order to have an effective impact on the national security angle of our government in trying to thwart that without running the risk of, well, for instance, I remember in the paranoia days of Crafty Richard Nixon, where I attended, when I was about 15 years old, I attended a speech at Florida State University in the park, and across the street from this small gathering were these two very conspicuous individuals in suits and trench coats with dark glasses chatting at each other and pointing. I guess my paranoia personally is that it's gotten so heinous in our government now that the national security state has helped to separate the citizenry of the United States from its constitutional rights. Gore Vidal, in finishing the diatribe he gave, did hold out the possibility that if certain actions were done, we would have a chance to have America emerge and live and survive the specter of the national security state. And again, I guess my question is, what can I do without the IRS coming down on my head, without my name ending up on some file somewhere because I wrote to one of my congressmen and said, look at what's going on here. Look at what's going on here, and him going, oh, God, I don't know anything about this. What can I do about this? You know, and in that, I think that our government is almost as powerless to combat the national security state as we are as individuals. Please help. Thank you.
Yeah. The reaction that you evoke in me is one of great warmth but also wanting to leap and grab you by the throat and shake you. There is no easy solution to these games. People are the 6 million people dying. The Contra activities down in Nicaragua. We're so safe and secure in our beautiful, rich country up here. We're so spoiled, we're so insulated and isolated from the danger and the horrors that we're soft to the point where we want it the easy way. Show me an easy way to save me from horror. There is no easy way. This country was founded in vigilance and fighting for freedom and paranoia. The first flag was the 13-headed snake. Don't tread on me. We've been so conditioned in our softness and our isolation from war. It's been so long since we've tasted of war ourselves that the result is that we're afraid. We are, it's not exactly apathy, there's an intellectual concern, but we have a visceral fear. In the countries where people really suffer and really die, they take to the streets to protest the police. The Nicaraguan Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the people taking to the streets in Korea where the police don't play games, the rising up in the Philippines that forced the ouster of Marcos, the rising up in Haiti that forced the ouster of Baby Doc, the rising up in Iran that forced the ouster of the Shah, the rising up in South Africa where people are saying if we're going to die, we might as well die standing up instead of just passively being hauled off. We have been conditioned to believe in the goodness of our system to the point where we cannot conceive or understand of the threat of a Looney Tune like Oliver North. He's charismatic and he's glamorous, and so people are saying, wow, Ollie by golly, This man is been plotting a military takeover of this country. People that crossed him, he was calling out the FBI. Jack Terrell, for example, was a member of his program and went to the FBI to expose the program and its illegalities and its drug smuggling, and Ollie heard about it and called the FBI and targeted them on the man. Brian Wilson was targeted by Ollie. We have the memos. He was doing a Gandhian nonviolent fast on the steps of the nation's capital, and Ollie wrote a memo to the FBI saying the guy was a terrorist and had to be treated as such. Now, how did that work? When Wilson did his demonstration on the railroad tracks at Concord Naval Weapons Station, the engineers of the train were told that they had an FBI report, security had an FBI report that that there were terrorists on the railroad tracks up there, and that explains why the engineers, instead of stopping, laid the metal down and went and rode right over him, in fact. What I seriously suggest that people have to do I don't want to sound hysterical. I'm not hysterical. But what you have to do is understand we're running out of time on every front. We're running out of time in terms of the arms race. We're running out of time in terms of the environment. And these people are taking away our liberties about as fast as the legislative and judicial process can absorb them, moving us in the direction of a military, a national security state where the Louis Giuffridas and Ollie Norths will be and George Bush's and Ronald Reagan's will be in firm military control. There is no safe in today's world. Go home tonight and take out your dictionary and erase the words safe and secure. Come to terms with your own mortality. There is nowhere to hide. You can't get on a bus and get off on Mars and say, we're safe now, we don't have to worry anymore. It is not a factor in today's world. It is no longer a question of people dying in El Salvador and people dying in Nicaragua. The world is interconnected. The problems of the world interrelate. This is something, once again, I turn to the women's movement. They have had a sense and have been teaching and projecting a sense of the world's interconnectedness long before the other peace movements have gotten into this. I don't know if that encourages you very much, but it's the simple and harsh facts. Now, what can you do? You got to stand up. If you get run over in the process, I don't know. I don't want to get run over by their machinery. I don't want to be put in jail. But also, I don't want the alternative either. And I know what's going to happen if we don't stand up and make changes happen. And I would rather go down trying to save our beautiful planet and make it a better place to live than sit around afraid to speak out.
On the subject of Nicaragua, I believe you commented earlier on that the CIA had given funding directly to the Mosquito Indians to perpetuate the covert activities in Nicaragua. Would you kindly elaborate on the reasons for the funding, the approximate dollar amount, and whether or not any of the funding was accepted by Brooklyn Rivera's people?
On the latter part, yes. I'm trying to draw up my computer banks on the details of the mosquitoes. This question hasn't come up in a couple of years. As a matter of fact, as people got distracted into the Iran-Contra thing, but Rivera, yes. The concept, it has been done in it's a basic CI operating technique. Now, mind you, there is a thread, I don't have to verbalize it, there's a thread of depravity in CI activities, the amorality as they call it, the torture training program, to destabilize a society. In the ivory towers of Washington, they call it attacking the economy. And if you're attacking a communist economy, you can go home at night and sit and watch TV with your kids and feel like a nice, decent person, because attacking a communist economy is something everybody ought to do a little bit every day, you know. But when you translate that in terms of people, you know, it means going in and blowing up the infrastructure of their lives and killing some of them. As one congressman I was bearding in his office said, "Look, John, it's a harsh world out there. If some women are going to have to get raped in the process of our policing the place, I'm sorry for them, but that's the way it's going to have to be." Now, the Mosquito Indians, this thing about working on the minorities, they did it in Vietnam. They did it in Laos and Thailand with the Mao, the Hmongs, with the result that the people were eventually decimated, virtually ceased to exist as a people. They did it in Iran, Iraq. The Shah called the CIA in to work with the Kurds, to arm them to rise up against the Iraqis, to put pressure on the Iraqi government. The Iraqis came to terms. The Shah called Henry Kissinger and said, okay, pull them off. And so Kissinger told the CIA to pull off aid to the Kurds, leaving them defenseless in front of the Iraqi forces. When 200,000 of them fled into Iran, then the Shah came to us and said, feed them. You know, it was your program, feed them. And Henry Kissinger advised the Congress that we shouldn't do it. He said covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Getting back to the Mosquito Indians, this concept, these were Indian groupings who had always had trouble getting along, differing interests with the people, the main part of the population on the other side of the country in the heartland. The CI had contact with them. Stedman Fago was the major contact point. The CI had contact with him apparently when Somoza was still in power. And they went to him with relatively small amounts of money, but still more money than they had seen in the entirety of history, and arms and training, and sent them in now to destabilize in the areas mostly where their own people lived. Now, the Sandinistas' initial reaction was to pull the people back forcibly, to relocate them further away where they couldn't be accessed by the Contra forces. And of course, then we had a propaganda coup to trumpet to the world saying that the Sandinistas were abusing the minorities in their country. And it took the Sandinistas about 2 years to get wise to this, and the Ministry of Interior, Tomas Borge, began working on a program of dialogue with the mosquitoes that eventually was sufficiently effective that when they had the amnesty in 1986, they allowed the mosquitoes to come back into their villages without laying down their weapons, the mosquito contras, without laying down their weapons. They now have more autonomy than any Indian group in any Latin American country. There's a group of them still holed up in Honduras where they are not well treated by Honduras. They're the subject of attack and abuse, and they've not been able to go home either. And the U.S. policy is to try to keep them there, to try to keep them isolated, hoping to use them to continue to destabilize Nicaragua. I'm sorry I don't remember the exact figures, but with a very little digging through your Nicaraguan Information Center, you can come up, there's a number of excellent articles written about many aspects of the mosquito program and problems, and some of the articles are very sympathetic but don't understand the published fact that we were arming them. They see the Sandinista activity and the mosquito activity without understanding that this was a formal part of the destabilization program we were running.
Well, just to elaborate a little further, my understanding of the mosquitoes is that they're a fourth world group of people struggling for self-determination in a battle between the right and left, and that Brooklyn Rivera is their leader. And you didn't directly answer my question as to whether or not he had directly accepted funding from the CIA.
I did. I said it was my understanding that he had. I have, yes, there's no quarrel with the concept of the lost peoples, and unfortunately they're all over the world who are caught in between the crevices of the artificial lines that were drawn to create states, and they don't fit into this state or that one, and we call it nationalism, and suddenly they have no choice. They're a member, in that case the mosquitoes are a member of Nicaragua, and their instincts, sort of like the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania, wanting to keep their own cultural identity and ways, and yet the governments have other plans and policies for modernization. So a tension between them everywhere, which is unfortunate, often tragic, but when the CIA goes in to arm the minority, to get them to rebel, it becomes, again, I consider it depraved, but it's a standard operating technique.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
You mentioned briefly about the connection with the CIA and drugs and drug cartels and stuff, and we certainly have a serious drug problem in this country. What, in your opinion, is really going on with the war on drugs, and what is going to happen with that?
Well, if our establishment was serious about the war on drugs, the first thing they would do is go and arrest George Bush, and Ronald Reagan, and Ollie North. And Ed Meese and the others. We have in the public record evidence of their involvement in drug smuggling and protection and conspiracy and drug smuggling. Like I say, if we were serious, they were serious about the war, they would start at the top, and then that example could go down through the infrastructure of our police, which has been bought so heavily into the drug machinery. Now, mind you, I am not saying that every FBI officer and every DEA officer and every customs officer is corrupt. That simply is not true. I'm sure that most of them are not corrupt. The trouble is that they try to do their jobs, and they try to investigate someone for smuggling drugs, and they wind up getting a rap on the knuckles and told to mind their own business and stay out of national security. And you get a couple of those happen, and you become cynical, and you see it happening all around you, and obviously you are forced to sort of get your head down and try to get yourself through a career without getting eliminated. So, what is all the hullabaloo about drugs if they're not serious about breaking the stuff up from the top? And the answer is that it's a very politically viable thing. They can get verbal support, lip service support, popular support. They can allocate tax dollars. And it is a fabulous excuse to motivate the society and militarize the society and get the National Guard to get new powers in this society that they never had before. One of the problems with the drug problem is that no level of the society is totally outraged. Our tolerance at every level of the society is extraordinary. At the bottom, I don't like that analogy, but let's say at the bottom of society, drugs have always been counterculture, protest. Kids in the Vietnam War smoking pot and doing drugs as a protest, as a symbol of protest. At the very top, the bankers like it because the money is not invested in banks on Mars. It's laundered through Panama and the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas and invested in shopping centers in the United States itself. And in between, you have the doctors and firemen and police and insurance executives doing cocaine if they can afford it, if not doing crack. And so the result is that there's no one who doesn't know someone who has a drug problem, or someone in the family with a drug problem, or has teenagers that dabble with drugs, or has not dabbled at some point themselves. And so who's outraged? Who's offended? It's a big problem in the society, but if there were a real moral outrage, we would have demanded that George Bush be put in jail. When all this evidence came out, people yawned. Because everybody knows somebody who's doing drugs, or they themselves did last year, if not last week. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask you a couple of personal questions, and I'll certainly understand if you don't want to answer them. First, the last part of your professional life has obviously been drastically different from the first part. I'd be very interested in what made you switch and when it happened. And second, you have spoken very freely here tonight. Has there been any limitation on your ability to give these ideas publicly?
Yeah, on the second question, I was sued. The profits from my book, In Search of Enemies, were seized by the government. Anyone who buys a copy of it, you're donating some money to the government, so I always tell people to get it from your library if you can. And then my publisher bitches at me, and so I tell people, buy it, but share it with your friends, you know. But I was also put under a court order that anything else I write, and it's an open-ended order, I presume, for the rest of my life, or at least until that judge dies, I have to submit for censorship, or I risk going to jail without trial. I've had the FBI come by a couple of times and lay carefully worded threats on me, which I did not impress me greatly, because they were sort of saying the CIA didn't like what I was doing, and I was saying I didn't expect them to. I've not been beaten up. My family has not been beaten up. The people in our community, when my book came out, I was concerned. So I certainly have not, suffered any abuse, or persecution. Certainly an economic sacrifice, if you will. It's been hard sledding to make a living. We lost everything and had to move in with my parents. And for 2 years in the mid-'80s, my wife and I lived in my father's tool shed behind the house while the kids slept up in the house, and we cooked outside. We left the country at one point because we just simply couldn't find a way to make a living here, and then people raised some money and brought us back to lecture. And the lecturing has grown, and my writing has grown a little bit. So we're sort of breaking even now, tenuously. The book that we have up in New York right now is going as deep as I can, humanly, psychologically, into the explanation of What made me get out? It doesn't cover the whole story, but I use the experience in Vietnam. Let me put it this way. We'd worked on it for 3.5 years. It's a very complicated book. I mean, if you'll picture trying to write a book in which you're capturing the complexities of your own psyche and conditioning and brainwashing and breaking away, which is a challenge enough unto itself for this would-be boy writer, and you're also trying to write to help your wife write. And my wife is very intelligent, but she was not born in the States, and English is her second language, and so she's not a writer in English. So I'm, in effect, ghostwriting for her to capture woman's anger. I mean, ideally, she should have had a feminist writer writing her side of it, but that just simply wasn't possible. But capturing her anger at the war when I was one of the villains, in creating anger, trying to get her to tell the story. And I mean literally in some of the situations where I was getting insights into how she felt, I was ducking video cassettes that were flying at me, and then afterwards sit down and and talk about it and write some pages and talk about it some more and keep our marriage together. Very, very complicated. I have another full lecture that I give on occasion in which it's called Getting In and Getting Out, a Career in the CIA, where I do anecdotally how we were recruited and conditioned and trained and what we did and what happened by detail that got me out. To say it in sort of 30 seconds, I was conditioned from childhood to a conservative view, World War II, the Korean War, ROTC, the Marine Corps, the CIA training, to a view of the world that was superficial and false. Us, the good guys, saving the world from the evils of communism. I believed it. No one ever made a comment in my entire life giving me a thought, planting the seed of a thought in another direction. I got in the CIA, I got higher up, I began to see cynicism, but they give you rationales. I had some agents killed, but they said it's a tough world, it's a Cold War, you're going to take losses sometimes. I had my boss in Vietnam. I was keeping my post open because we had an important operation there. I was risking my life. The road was cut, we were shelled every day, it was very hairy for 5 months. I got a big gold medal for it, which I gave back to them at the end. Only to find that this vital intelligence that I was getting, the chief of station was resisting sending it to Washington. Instead, he was delivering it with other intelligence to the Hungarian communist colonels of the International Peacekeeping Force for them to deliver to Hanoi. And he was not executed for treason. He was promoted afterwards and was hired by the Iran-Contra Cover-Up Committee in the summer of 1987 to advise them on how to investigate the CIA. So that level of cynicism, I saw it. Let me put it this way. I got this book written talking about all of these things and the utter disillusion. Now remember, Robin Morgan's book, The Sexuality of Terrorism, the stimulation, the macho, testosterone, the male sexual stimulation through violence, and the price women have paid throughout history for it. Her book is sort of like an intellectual preview of what Mai Lee and I are trying to write about our own living experience. We sent the manuscript up to New York, and the agent bounced it back saying, "John, it doesn't work. You're in an utterly depraved incident, and then the next day you're back at the typewriter working again. Why didn't you quit?" And so I hadn't really captured the bondage that the blinders they put on, the bonds that they tie on your soul. And so and she also wanted Mai Lee to reach deeper into her own anger and pain. And so we gave it another shot and sent it back to her, and 3 months hard work, and sent it back to her, and she says it works now, and the publishers are looking at it right now, so keep your fingers crossed. The metaphors that I used in trying to solve the thing, to explain it eventually, were one, the metaphor of the endomorph, An endomorph, according to Webster, is a crystal of one species that's completely enclosed by a crystal of another species. And I had a semi-literate background. I came from a family of nonviolent people. My father's side, they moved down to Texas to escape fighting each other in the Civil War. My mother's side, my mother wanted to be a vegetarian, living on a farm in Texas because she didn't want to kill animals. And the family wouldn't let her because they couldn't afford an eccentric daughter eating vegetables, but that she felt rather strongly about it. My father, when we went to live in Africa for 10 years as a kid, he taught me how to shoot and got me a rifle and taught me good habits and training and care of the weapon and all of that. But a curious thing was that he would never shoot anything. He would go out with me to be out with me in the out of doors, but he would never shoot anything. And I was, a young lad with a weapon, with the testosterone and all the phallic stuff of hunting, and I couldn't understand why he wouldn't shoot anything. Even one time in a situation where we had a leopard marauding, killing goats, and we staked out a place at night in the moonlight, and we're watching for this leopard to come, and he gave me the shotgun, and our lives were theoretically at stake. And I was only about 15, and I didn't understand then. Now I understand. And during World War II, he worked for a chemical plant. He volunteered for the Seabees. He was willing to support our country in that struggle, but he wasn't willing to kill people. It wasn't a religious thing with him. It wasn't an intellectual thing. He just didn't want to kill people. He's not, it's not a wimp factor. God knows. This guy grew up on a farm. His dad was a lawyer, but they had a farm, and he grew up milking cows, and he has arms like alley-oop with a hand grip that can crush bones, and he was running trucks and building hydroelectric plants overseas and sawmills, and taught me how to drive in a 5-ton truck. It never affected my sense of identity or strength. He was the strongest man I ever met, and he just didn't want to kill people. Now, I came from that background, and yet they managed to to brainwash, to condition me to be a 20th century warrior. The demon lover, as Robin Morgan calls it, committed my life to all the violent rationales. Now, the reason I belabor this point is because if they could do that to me, coming from a nonviolent background, and condition me to be a soldier, then surely it could work in the other direction. Surely we could, if society set itself out to do it, instead of exploiting the young male's testosterone poisoning, we could teach and condition them to be more like my father was and find other constructive outlets for the male aggression, for the male energy, if you will. And the concept really interests me a great deal. He directed his energies not into violence but into building. And this is what Carl Sagan is saying. Look at what we could have done with this world if we'd spent those $10 trillion on building the infrastructure of this world instead of the Cold War and destabilizing it. The other analogy that I make that may help people understand why it was so hard to quit and why others don't quit, why Bud McFarlane, who was in my Marine Corps Basic School class, could go through all of the stuff he did to the point of suicide and still not break free mentally. I did break free, but why he couldn't, why it's so hard, why through the entire Vietnam War, even after they all turned against it, after McNamara had a breakdown, and he went to Vietnam and he was briefed and he knew it was over, and yet flying back home, he never broke publicly. On his way flying back home, he held a press conference giving the rationales for the war. The result, or the analogy that I use to explain this, is football. The society is sufficiently into football that many people suddenly understand when you put it in these terms. You're an all-pro with the Dallas Cowboys, huh? You've been a star since Pee Wee football when you were 10 years old. You were all state in high school lifting weights and all something or other in college and an all-pro, and you're with the Dallas Cowboys, and you're losing. You've lost 10 straight games, and you're getting whipped 44-0, and the coaches are sending in dumb plays. Tom Landry is burnt out, but he's too stubborn to quit. You know about the drugs, you know about the corruption, and you're getting walloped out there on the field. Do you walk off the field and quit? I don't think it's happened in the history of football. You're not programmed to quit. In your software, there is no quit key or program. What you do is you play your way through the game. You go back on the field another 20 times and butt heads and get run over. And in the press conference afterwards, you say, well, we gave it our best. We're a little down this year. We've had some injuries. We're rebuilding. We'll be back next year. And then you retire when the time comes, and you hope you'll make the Hall of Fame or become a sportscaster, or at least have fond memories and be respected by all your former buddies and be able to have a drink with them now and then. And you don't quit. It just simply isn't a part of your program to quit. And that's what I went through in Vietnam, as all of this depravity was happening around me. And in this book, I work against this my predecessor who did quit. And in my mental, but he wasn't made out of the same stuff I was. I was a good soldier. I was a real Marine. He wasn't a Marine. He quit, but I couldn't quit. It never entered my mind. I went on to run the Angola thing, and then eventually the inner crystal heated up to the point where it shattered the outer crystal, and I was able to go public and speak out and begin to grow, I might say, and learn what the world was really about that I'd been part of. Thank you. Thank you.